And it was only due to these people's will to look Russian soldiers directly in the eye and say, I don't care, get out of my city, you're not taking it. Get out of our town, you're not taking it. That they were able to hold out. They rejected Russian demands. A month and a half later, the Russians are gone. A representative of one of the most powerful military forces in the world, right in front of them. It was only due to that they were able to push them back and win. I wanted to talk about this clip. Like, I saw like Lefty Stu and other people in the space like soying out over this clip. Like, this clip's amazing, and I wanted to play it for you.
I would love, colleague Jambaski, to tell me any circumstance in which NATO has played a productive role or delivered peace anywhere. History has taught us that sanctions do not end military conflicts. They do not bring peace. They make the people suffer, not the oligarchs, the people of Russia, the people of Europe. And they're not going to help save lives, because the more arms you pump into Ukraine, the more the war will be prolonged, the more Ukrainians will die. And it might sound radical, colleagues, but the answer to war is not more war, it's peace. And peace isn't delivered by the barrel of a gun, it's delivered by diplomacy, by dialogue. You can wish away your continent's history, but we share a continent with Russia. We will sit down with Russia. There will be a negotiated peace, and this organisation should be promoting it earlier rather than delaying it and making sure that more Ukrainians die. Your feigning of sympathy rings hollow. It makes me sick, to be honest with you.
So the reason why this guy reacted the way he did is because he's Bulgarian, okay? Like Iron Curtain living, so to speak, you know? It's always the Eastern Europeans, you know? The Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Moldovans, the Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Hungarians, the Czechs, who would probably all react in a very similar way to the sentiment. And so can I also just say that there's something about the Irish. If there's anything I know about Irish history, it's that Ireland got its independence by asking nicely. Ireland went up to the UK and said, can we be independent? And they were like, okay. And that's what happened. There was no other history attached there. Nothing. Look, the first thing I want to say is peace cannot be obtained through just rolling over, okay? I mean, it can, but that's peace under subjugation. And that's no peace that I think I or anyone would want to be a part of. There's a reason as an American, you know, there was the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. People were willing to pick up guns in order to defend some ideals they felt that they were being not held to, right? If you look at Irish history, for example, to talk about this person's home country and the original tweet, the Irish fought 800 years for their independence, 800 years of struggle in order for them to have a sovereign country, and that country still isn't even united. The Easter Rising was not a day where people went over to the Queen's Palace and had tea and crumpets with the Queen. It was a violent attempt at revolution. Michael Collins did not get Irish sovereignty by sitting down with British officials and saying, oh, isn't this tea lovely? Isn't it wonderful? Now, about that Irish independence, no. The dude fought and died for it. Now, eventually, they did sit down to negotiate the terms of independence, but they negotiated from a position of strength. Because if you were just going around the world asking states to just give you stuff for free, I'm sorry, that's not how the world works. Countries act in their own interest, okay? I hate to be a hardcore realist, definitely, since people say I'm more of a liberal internationalist or whatever, but that's just the fact of the matter. If you look at the history of independence struggles or struggles for sovereignty, it is bloody and it is difficult. Look at the struggle for Algerian independence from the French, for example. The struggle for Irish independence, American independence, any independence struggle, really. A lot of it is quite violent and bloody, but a lot of it was necessary in order for a people to have its sovereignty respected and for them to be able to rule themselves on their own terms. For democracy, in many instances, for them to be able to run their own democracies. There is this just overlying idea of pacifism at all costs. No matter what, we must always just roll over and let ourselves be subjugated because war is so bad that we'd rather be anybody's bitch instead of actually, and I'm sorry to use the language, but instead of actually just, standing up for ourselves. I reject this principle. And I got into foreign policy under the idea of doing everything you can to preserve peace. Forgot I was a Gravel kid. Now, do I agree with everything I thought at the time? Do I agree with all of those things now today? No, I don't. I've grown a lot in my foreign policy perspectives. But my main interest when I joined that campaign was I believe that peace should be a top priority. But it should not be the thing that you spend everything in the world to obtain, including your freedoms, your sovereignty, and your democracy. There's certain things that are worth fighting and dying for. Let me turn off this music. By God, Tomb Raider music. There are certain things that are worth fighting and dying for. Things like democracy, freedom, and sovereignty. This is even more so when the country invading you is butchering your civilian population, tying your hands behind your back and shooting you, shooting people going home from work with armored vehicles, mowing down the elderly outside of hospitals with armored vehicles. There is video proof of that. That isn't an allegation. That is a thing that happened, and we know it happened. The bombing of schools, the bombing of hospitals, maternity wards, over 150 dead kids, 700 people in Chernihiv, over 5,000 in Mariupol. That number is going to skyrocket once this is all said and done. And are we really saying that an army that would act this brutally towards the civilian population would not use that same type of brutality towards, say, government officials or dissidents? I mean, we saw occupation forces arrest local mayors in the South. People have disappeared. We don't know where a lot of people are. They're just gone. That is something worth putting everything on the line for, whether people like it or not. There was a lot of things that contributed to Ukrainian success and winning the Battle of Kiev, the Battle for Sumy, the Battle for Chernihiv, and holding Mariupol for so long, stopping them from taking Mykolaiv, or eventually taking back Hostomel Airport, any of these things. There was a lot of things that contributed to it. A lot of it was Ukrainian will, Ukrainian determination to fight. As an American, I remember quite vividly, just 1 year ago, watching the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that withdrawal is not remembered well because we lost 13 Americans, a lot of other Afghan civilians, and a lot of people who worked with us that are just now dead, either killed by the Taliban or people that fell off the plane. Or here's something especially that I want to point to. The government collapsed. It just collapsed under the Taliban's pressure. We hadn't even left the country yet. While it was time for us to get out of the country, and I believe Joe Biden was right in withdrawing from Afghanistan, it was not a war that we were going to win by being there for a few extra years. It collapsed so fast, faster than anybody, anywhere could have predicted. You could have had the most anti-America news outlet in the world or something. You could have had Press TV, RT America, and like make a new thing with like the North Korean news outlets. And this news outlet would not have predicted the government to collapse as fast as it did. And Ashraf Ghani, which was the leader of Afghanistan, fled the country with just handbags and suitcases full of cash that he had embezzled from the government, that corrupt son of a bitch. And he fled, and all of these crooks got out, and the government collapsed. And those were the people that really, I think, at the end of the day, doomed Afghanistan. The people who robbed and were corrupt and associated the Western style of democracy, or the style of democracy that was being implemented in Afghanistan, basically associated that permanently with corruption. just due to the way of how they manage their governments. And due to that mismanagement, due to the failure of democracy there, due to it being, I think in large parts, like backed by foreign power and seen as like a part of an occupation, even though the Taliban is not especially popular, it failed because there was no will among Afghans to fight, and it failed. After 20 years, 21 years, man, of that war, where people who were born after the war started were fighting the war, lost in like a month because there was no will to fight. And for Afghans, there was nothing worth defending. We remember that vividly. It's extremely depressing because it set back things like women's rights and all that. And hell, Afghanistan right now is in a state of disarray. And a lot of this is, I would say, it was our fault when it comes to the famine that's going on there and our holding of certain assets. But that's a topic for another day that I still do plan to do a video on. But that isn't the situation in Ukraine. Many thought it would be. A lot of people thought it would be, the war would be over in 3 days. Hell, Russian officials thought it would be over in 3 days. Western officials thought it would be over very quickly. If you look at what the United States did, the United States offered Zelensky a ride out of the country. And of course, like the response that everyone remembers, even who knows of how true it is or not, was, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And we saw footage coming out of Ukrainians filling up Molotov cocktails, getting ready to fight street by street, room by room in places like Kiev. We saw Russian forces get rebuked at Kharkiv twice. We saw cities get surrounded for over a month in the north. I think it was Konotop, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but Sumy is another example. This Cherniv, places surrounded that just hold it out for over a month and a half, even though the Russian bombardment killed over 700 Ukrainians, and they held out. They were offered surrender. They were offered multiple times, like surrender, and they rejected it. There was once, and I wonder if anybody could find the footage. There was this one time where there was these two Russian soldiers who went into a town with grenades, with the pins pulled and their hands on the grenades, meaning if they were shot and they let go, they'd kill everybody. And they went in there and they said, we're offering you an opportunity to surrender. And so the town had like a town council out in the public, and the people overwhelmingly rebuked it. No. And remember, this is not like a huge city. This is like a small town. Here's the footage, actually. Here it is, right here. And you want to know the funny thing about this? And I covered this a while ago when it happened. This small town actually ended up holding out for the entirety of the Russian invasion of the north of the country and never fell. Ever. It never fell. And it was only due to these people's will to look Russian soldiers directly in the eye and say, I don't care, get out of my city, you're not taking it. Get out of our town, you're not taking it. That they were able to hold out. They rejected Russian demands. A month and a half later, the Russians are gone. A representative of one of the most powerful military forces in the world, right in front of them. It was only due to that they were able to push them back and win. And let's look at this footage again. It's wild. Remember, these soldiers told they're going to be liberators. They walk in, they get yelled at, they get lambasted. The local townsfolk know they are coming here to ask for the town to surrender. And the response they get is just for all the residents to run up to them while they have bombs in their hands and just start yelling at them. Just get out of our town. We don't want you here. Completely rejecting this request for surrender.
Вони нам поставили умови зараз. Якщо ми починаємо супротив, вони розносять місто артилерії. Якщо за... Ура! Ура! Заебись! Заебись!
What's interesting about this woman, right? And the statement she made here is that it feels like to her, there's nothing worth defending in Ukraine, you know? That the thing is, at the end of the day, the solution isn't to help the Ukrainians who are willing to fight. And ultimately, over everything else, it is up to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government if they want to hold out, right? It is their popularly, democratically elected government. And obviously, the vast majority of the consensus in Ukraine, from anyone with 2 brain cells could tell, is that the vast majority of Ukrainians want to fight against the Russian invasion and defend their country, right? And ultimately, it is not somebody from Ireland who determines whether or not they should or shouldn't fight for their sovereignty, or should or shouldn't accept the annexation of their territory, or regime change, or demilitarization so Russia can make Ukraine their bitch constantly and reinvade at any point and be met with no resistance next time. Or if they should just accept the war crimes that have been done upon them and not pick up arms to stop the people coming in and butchering their civilians. It is not up to some random person from Ireland who is not affected by the bombardment, not affected by the invasion, is not having their territory annexed. Their own country's history is defined by bloody struggle against occupation. It is not up to them to determine whether the Ukrainians have the will to fight or if they should or shouldn't fight. It isn't. And if anything, NATO and NATO countries that are sending these weapons to Ukraine are giving Ukraine the leverage in negotiations, when the negotiations eventually do happen, because there have been negotiations going on, but nothing's been really agreed upon. When the negotiations wrap up and eventually they do actually come to a consensus, these weapons will have in many ways not only saved Ukraine when it comes to its sovereignty and stopping regime change, and when it comes to stopping demilitarization of the country, which would mean that Russia could invade at any point and be met with zero resistance, but it was also just important in the protecting of Ukrainian civilians when it came to stopping the onslaught into Kiev. I mean, we saw what the Russian military did in the Kiev Oblast. Imagine if it captured the largest city in all of Ukraine. In Kiev. The largest city. Kiev is the largest city in all of Ukraine with the biggest population of 3 million people. Imagine what would have happened if they captured that, considering what they did in the Oblast, executing people with their hands tied behind their back. Could you imagine me running over to Ireland during the 1920s, and there was some civilian executed by the local British authorities, and I just said, just negotiate. Be a ridiculous response to the situation. A response that would be scoffed at for good reason. The reason why Ireland got its independence wasn't because they walked up to the British and said, once the British sent their military and said, okay, we give up, we negotiate. It was, no, I'm going to kill some fucking British soldiers. We're going to make you see that this occupation is not worth it. And then once you realize it's not worth it and we have leverage, then we'll negotiate. And we'll negotiate your departure out of our fucking country. Now, obviously, they didn't get all of Ireland, but it was that fighting and it was that leverage they had through combat that was integral for them to get their own country. It was integral. And so the weapons Ukraine has right now, many of them Western provided, and the fighting that Ukraine is doing right now is integral for them keeping their sovereignty, keeping their democracy, stopping regime change, stopping their demilitarization, and stopping the annexation of their territory. The thing is, just like Ireland had hundreds of years of resistance to occupation, so has Ukraine. Hundreds of years of Cossack rebellions and many other things, and resistance to Russian chauvinism over Ukraine. And you can even hear it from how Vladimir Putin talks about Ukraine as if it doesn't have a right to exist, that they're just little Russians. It reminds me of how the Turkish government has talked of Kurdish people as though they're not Kurdish. They're Mountain Turks. They're not Ukrainians. They're little Russians. Reminds me of that. And just like in Turkey, how the Kurdish language was banned, there was times where the Ukrainian language was banned. So it's very strange to see people talking about, oh, that Irish fire. Oh my goodness. when the history of Ireland, when it comes to sovereignty and resistance against occupation, is integral to their identity, to their culture, and to their history. And so, like, I don't know. I mean, it feels like just a complete, like, they're just rebuking hundreds of years of Irish history when you're saying, oh, that Irish fire, when you have this Irish fellow come up here and say, well, you know, maybe Ukraine should just, you know, give up. Maybe the West should just say, okay, we'll negotiate now. We'll negotiate from a position of weakness and negotiate away Ukraine's freedom. I mean, let's be serious for a moment. Let's say that we decided on February 22nd, right, 2-3 days after the invasion started, that was going to be the day we negotiated. Russian demands would be the exact same as they were on day one. Basically no different. Be the second, third day of the invasion. That was the day we negotiated. And in the interest of peace, we accepted it. What would that lead to? Probably regime change, a demilitarized Ukraine, possibly the annexation of Donetsk and Luhansk, who knows? The recognition of the annexation of Crimea, and basically Ukraine's democracy being murdered in the street. Now, compare that to if they were to negotiate today. The idea of regime change, that's not on the table. It just isn't. Demilitarization? Not on the table. It just isn't. There's certain things like Donetsk and Luhansk, which the Russians are very much still like, this is on the table. When it comes to NATO and like the idea of Russia saying we will control what treaties you can and cannot be in, when it comes to like being inside NATO because of, you know, they're saying, oh, NATO's encircling us. That's still to them on the table. But you can just see the massive shift here, how much that 1.5 months did for the future of Ukraine, having a sovereign country, not being little Russians, but being Ukrainians. And so it's very strange to see people come out here and willing to gut every value they have and roll over in the name of preserving a peace that probably won't even last. I mean, let's say you were a Ukrainian government and in the name of peace, you accepted the original Russian demands, which were ridiculous. That government would have been ran out of town. It would have been no different than Euromaidan. And the only difference is the war would have continued, but with less unity. Anyway, that's enough of that.